Welcome. You're watching Eye on Harvard. I'm Ogan Gurel, AB 86, and we have a great show ahead of us. Thanks for joining us today. As you know, we start out with the weekly Harvard Roundup, and then we go into our guest. Our guest today is Dr. Chris Stout, who I'll introduce formally shortly. But some of the topics of discussion, he's a leading psychologist in the academic as well as practical world. He's the founding director of the Center for Global Initiatives and the author of a book, Psychology of Terrorism, among many other accomplishments. It's going to be a fascinating hour ahead. But first, the weekly Harvard Roundup. The first is obviously the sad story this morning of Norman Mailer. Some of you may know that he earned a Bachelor's of Science in Aeronautical Engineering in 1943. And he died this morning in New York. And he was a Harvard grad, and obviously many people know him for many of his literary, political, and commentary accomplishments. He was a very controversial figure, as you know, and he, in a sense, both wrote about and embodied the contradictions and controversies in American society, the very liberal side, the very conservative side. He was an arch anti-feminist of sorts, and he was also a very strong liberal. So he truly a very important individual for American life and letters, and we mourn his loss. And in particular, for me personally, I didn't know Norman Mailer, but his son, Michael Mailer, was a classmate of mine at Harvard as well, and our condolences go out to him and his family. Norman Mailer died this morning, age 84. What I would like to do is quote from him, because I think it's very relevant. His spirit lives on, if you will, to our discussion today. And to give a sense of his controversy, he said, "There's nothing safe about sex, there never will be." That's a typical Norman Mailer quote. But the quote that I think that we may actually discuss with our distinguished guest, Dr. Chris Stout, is Norman Mailer saying, "The natural role of 20th century man is anxiety." And I think that should be very interesting to comment on in the context of the psychology of terrorism. So Norman Mailer. The second person, very prominent Harvardian that we're going to talk, is Benazir Bhutto. Benazir Bhutto graduated with an AB degree in 1973 in economics, I believe, and obviously she has been very prominent in the news lately. We have not heard a lot from her, because she's gone in and out of house arrest, and I believe the latest is that she's out of house arrest. Clearly a very important individual on the world stage, and we'll be watching those developments in great detail. At the same rate, I would like to quote from her as well with respect to our discussion about the psychology of terrorism, among other topics with our guest. And Benazir Bhutto is quoted as saying, "Democracy is necessary to peace and to undermining the forces of terrorism." And it'll be very interesting to see, to what extent social structures, political structures, either are taken advantage of by terrorists or can counter terrorists. So, again, Norman Mailer and Benazir Bhutto on the weekly Harvard Roundup. And now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our guest today, Chris Stout. Dr. Chris Stout, he is a doctor of psychology and also an MBA, and a truly integrative individual encompassing healthcare, psychology, academics, practical work in the field. We're going to learn a lot about his work in Cambodia, in Bolivia, am I correct, and Tanzania, among many other places. He is presently the founding director of the Center for Global Initiatives, which is the first center devoted to training multidisciplinary, and multidisciplinary, for those of you who watch the show, is a topic very near and dear to me, interdisciplinary healthcare professionals and students to bring services that are integrated, sustainable, resiliency-based, and have publicly accountable outcomes to areas of need. And what's fascinating about the Center for Global Initiatives, it's not so much global in the geographic sense as I understand it, but global in the subject sense of integrating. So there are so many accomplishments, Chris, to cover. You were named Person of the Week by, I forget, let me pull that up, by the House and Senate, recognized his work by proclamation of Dr. Chris E. Stout Week. He was on many programs, CNBC, CNN, WG, and NBC medical rounds. We are very honored and privileged to have you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, first of all, I just wanted to highlight Chris's Harvard connection. He did a postdoctoral fellowship in neurodevelopmental behavioral pediatrics
Well
at the
done.
Harvard Medical School and Children's Hospital.
Yeah.
And we had a chance to talk earlier, this was in 1988, how that Harvard experience, and just by the name of it, neurodevelopmental behavioral pediatrics, is very integrative.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
It was a great time. It was great to be at Harvard. It was great to be in Boston. Great to work at Children's Hospital. The faculty there were incredible, and probably one of the highlights was being able to work with T. Barry Brazelton and the work that he had done with children, and it really sort of spurred for me, the early part of my career was focused on working with children and families and doing a lot of diagnostic assessments. The kind of work that we did at Children's was, at the time, I think, rather groundbreaking. What is seen as being kind of standard practice today of looking at, in this case, children as individuals, but in very much a holistic kind of way. We worked with kids that had attention deficit disorders, to psychiatric disorders, to gastrointestinal problems, and looked at it very much from everyone's specialty. And my role as a fellow, besides just absorbing all that, was to learn a variety of other kinds of assessment skills that, for me as a psychologist, fit very well. But the other students in the classes were pediatricians and nursing students and whatnot, so it was very integrative even way back then.
Well, I know that one of the foci of Harvard with Larry Summers and with the current president as well has been to foster interdisciplinary studies. And this sounds like a pretty early incarnation of that.
Very much so with the clinical application. So.
Yeah, and I still think it's a challenge. And so tell us a little bit about how that program came about and the challenges in doing a truly integrative interdisciplinary program.
Sure. The program then was, again, open to really anyone from whatever discipline. You could be a psychologist or a physician, pediatrician, nursing, what have you. And from my perspective, the nice part was really being patient, child, or family focused. So that was really kind of the crucible that we looked at the problems. But we looked at the problems not just the biological with the child that the pediatrician might look at, but we also looked at it from a perspective, for me, with psychology, might come from a developmental psychology, a clinical psychology, a neuropsychology. But we also then worked with teachers. So we looked at the child in the social context of school. We looked at getting along if it was more emotional problems or issues like that. Did they get along with their peers? We would do interviews with the entire family, with the child present, without the child present. We would do it with siblings, and really try to understand the child in their context of their world, as well as their psychic world, as well as their biological world.
So very holistic and integrative.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a break shortly. I want to talk as soon as we return about interdisciplinary programs, what advice you might have, sort of in retrospect. I'm Ogan Gurel. Our guest, Dr. Chris Stout, the founding director of the Center for Global Initiatives. Stay right there. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Michael Momando. You're watching the In Time TV network, where professionals save big time connecting with their community worldwide. If you're in the restaurant or hospitality industry, I invite you to tune in to Restaurant Talk, where you can email or call in questions, comments, or concerns. You may even be a guest on our weekly Saturday show. To see a recent tasty episode of Restaurant Talk, please tune in to www.intimetv.com.
When someone abducts a child, they're not about to advertise it, but we will. Sign up at wirelessamberAlerts.org to get free Amber Alert text messages on your cell phone. Help put a child abductor out of business for good. Wireless Amber Alerts. A child is calling for help.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard. I'm Ogan Gurel. Our guest, Chris Stout, founding director of the Center for Global Initiatives, a world-renowned clinical psychologist, particularly for pediatric clinical psychologist. And he was talking about his experience in the neurodevelopmental behavioral pediatrics program at the Harvard Medical School. I'm getting better at that.
Yeah, very well.
And while we were at the break, we were talking about it was for Harvard, actually still a very, very unique interdisciplinary program. Mm-hmm. What advice would you have to Harvard administrators or to any academic administrator pull off such a program? What made it work?
I think a few things. One was having a cross multidisciplinary perspective. The fact that I could be shoulder to shoulder with a pediatrician was remarkably helpful for me, just to be able to get to know those individuals better, to know from their perspective of how they would work with children. I don't know, I always feel like I gain more than I'm ever able to provide to others, but I think perhaps I gave a little bit of insight into the pediatrician's better understanding where a clinical psychologist that works with children might come from. The context that we were working in was really one, again, of assessment. I came into it from a neuropsychology background and really learned a lot more from the developmental pediatric kind of background, but we were all learning things that had a very strong psychometric component to it. Mm-hmm. I think the thing today that, in looking back at it and feeling like it was, such a remarkable opportunity, I think the other aspect was just that the faculty were so focused on the work that it didn't necessarily matter what your professional background was, what your specialty was, because they looked at working with the children and their families in such a, again, cross multidisciplinary kind of perspective that it was just enriching, because the discussion was really about them, not necessarily what a certain discipline, with their narrow tunnel vision might look at. From an administrative perspective, I think about the only advice I could say to enhance that nowadays, which I already see people doing and see potential for further growth, is to understand the person in they do a good job with social context, but then also from cultural context, also from perhaps in that cultural context, religious context, and also maybe I don't know if it's trickier necessarily, but from an economic context of being able to understand. I have learned since then there's certain kinds of interventions or certain kinds of clinical expectations I may have on a family that's very difficult for them to do because of their economic situation. Both parents may work, getting child care, things like that put together, or getting tutelage for the child may just be an economic burden that isn't easily affordable for all families.
Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times about the problems in healthcare. I mean, he writes about it a lot, but it happens to be in today's New York Times when I was reading the story about Norman Mailer as well. He's a Harvard graduate. And he wrote about the fragmentation in different areas of healthcare. It would seem that more of this interdisciplinary work, just like you said, the cultural, the economic, the religious, etc., it's hard to do because there are so many separate constituencies.
Yeah, exactly right. Fragmentation in healthcare is remarkable. I see, further in some of the work that we do at the center is a fragmentation between primary care, public health, and behavioral health care. Again, all of us kind of read separate journals. We don't read each other's work. We go to our own conferences. We don't go to the others' conferences. There's so much, I think, the problem that we feel like there's so much to learn within our own specialties that it's so difficult to have the time or the ability to then look at others. So I think when there are programs, the start that we have with our center, to be able to try and put those things together and bring people together with projects that cross-cut those disciplines is a way to put it into action.
That's fascinating. On my other show, we had Dr. Peter Wyden, who is a renowned expert in psychosis at the University of Illinois. And the whole theme of his show was how he was reaching out to primary care doctors that we are actually very successful with our psychiatric interventions, psychiatric and psychological interventions, obviously not curing schizophrenia, but now the patients are surviving. And their medical problems become important.
Exactly.
The medical problems are what kills them. Is fatal, is dangerous morbidity, mortality. And those gaps are very hard to bridge, so it's great that you're doing this.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned a sort of controversial term, and Norman Mailer probably would have picked up on this and beaten us up, literally, about that. He was a famous pugilist, a boxer.
Yep.
Psychometric testing. I think it was in the 80s that Stephen Jay Gould was at Harvard as well. And I forget, there was a Harvard Medical School professor that was also fairly controversial. I forget his name, but he talked about IQ tests and quotas and things.
Right.
What is your perspective on psychometric testing, IQ testing? It seems like it's not as controversial quite as it was during that time.
Yeah,
How has that evolved?
That's a very straightforward question with a very complex
Yeah, I know.
set of answers. So
Well, that's why
I'll
we
take
have
a
you.
shot at it. A lot of the work that Stephen Jay Gould did, Panda's Thumb, and a lot of his evolutionary kinds of things before, I think he passed away maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. I had opportunity actually to meet with him a few times and look at things from, again, an evolutionary psychology kind of perspective. And I forget, I think, the controversial book that came out a few years back was called The Bell Curve.
Yes,
and
right.
They talked about, the distribution of the bell curve of very bright, not very bright, and the majority of everyone else in between. And I think the aspect of psychometric testing has gotten a bit more robust. I think that's thanks to the science of people that are involved in doing that kind of testing.
Perhaps thanks to people who were concerned about it, even if they were not
Correct.
scientists.
Well,
in that area.
if you've got a group of critics that you have to answer to, that make sure that people are typically good scientists, but you make doubly good, double sure that that's really the case in something that's controversial.
Yeah.
I think one of the things in early on in my training, and in a sense mentioned in another way of this context, is the cultural aspects. When you look at a broken leg, and it's a broken leg no matter what language you speak or no matter what time zone you live in, but the aspect of how we conceptualize intelligence is extremely culturally sensitive and culturally based. And the kinds of aspects in terms of how we measure that, if you presume, I'll just use a hypothetical, if you presume from a Western culture, and a Western culture that maybe is predominantly coming from a Caucasian perspective, that other perspectives and other measuring of other populations may not exactly be an adequate judgment. So for example, back, it was either 70s or 80s, to kind of point out the cultural difference, there was a test developed that was the acronym, we think of IQ for intelligence quotient. We'll talk about it after the break.
No problem. What's the name of it?
It's the BITCH test.
Okay, so just after the break, we're going to hear about the BITCH test. I'm Ogan Gurel. This is Eye on Harvard. Our guest, President and Founding Director of Center for Global Initiatives, Dr. Chris Stout. More ahead later, including the psychology of terrorism. Stay right there.
No matter where you live, life in the oceans depends on you. To keep our oceans clean, recycle and dispose of trash properly. To learn what you can do, go to keepoceansclean.org.
Once they've outgrown their toddler seat, they're still not ready for adult safety belts alone. 4'9" is the magic number. Until then, kids need a booster seat. Make sure your little pumpkin gets there safely. Visit boosterseat.gov.
Welcome back. I'm Ogan Gurel. You're watching Eye on Harvard. And I should say very briefly a short disclaimer. Our show is not officially related to, endorsed, or otherwise by the university, and as they say, the president and fellows of Harvard University. So no direct connection. Obviously, we're talking about Harvard graduates. We're talking about their impact on the world, such as Norman Mailer and Benazir Bhutto and Dr. Chris Stout, and the impact of the world on Harvardians as well. So welcome again, Eye on Harvard. And I want to talk a little bit more about Dr. Stout's background, Chris's background. He has academic appointments at the Northwestern University Medical School, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Is also affiliated with the University of Illinois College of Medicine Department of Psychiatry. Currently serves on the Illinois Disaster Mental Health Coalition, the International Center on Human Responses to Social Catastrophes at the University of Illinois, and Illinois' first Chief of Psychological Services for the Department of Human Services, Division of Mental Health, etc. He, whether you are aware of it, and certainly if you're in Illinois, has probably a very big impact on your life, and certainly when, God forbid, catastrophes occur. On a more international setting, he has been NGO Special Representative to the United Nations, appointed to the World Economic Forum's Global Leaders of Tomorrow in 2000, and as I mentioned, widely on the media, CNBC, CNN, and so forth. It's a pleasure to have you again.
Thanks.
So we were talking about IQ tests and how, to some extent, those have improved, the BITCH measure. Tell us a little bit about that.
That stands for Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. And the aspect of it was that to sort of make a political point, a cultural point, that depending upon how you structure a test can depend on whether or not someone comes up looking intelligent or not intelligent. And it was really kind of a political perspective to say we need to have a cultural consideration of this. I'm happy to say from what the research and what psychology has been able to, at least around intelligence and a variety of other kinds of tests, is to be able to have wider population distributions and more representative population distributions. So now oftentimes you can have specific kinds of, in particular, personality testing that might be specific to a certain group, a certain, even a certain population. For example, military personnel's fitness for duty, police officer fitness for duty, things like that. So the psychometric rigor of a lot of the tests that are used today is just remarkably robust and continues to get better every day.
And I guess perhaps one of the failings of the earlier tests was that they were just too broad in their application, as opposed to these very specific applications.
Exactly. Clinical psychologists today are very specific that if they're using, you try to use the most appropriate test for whatever the situation is, for the person, for the questions, for the referral, what have you. And if there's anything outside of what is a fairly restrictive normative range, then it's the responsibility of that psychologist to also make note of that in any kind of report.
Sure. I don't know if it was in Stephen Jay Gould's books, some of which I read, but he gave the example of, in New Guinea, I believe it was, how they would have failed miserably on Western intelligence tests, but a Westerner would have failed miserably in comparison to what they considered intelligence.
Absolutely.
So, for example, even at an early age, they could name hundreds of species of birds, which was essential to their life, their survival. Some birds they could eat, some birds they could catch, some they couldn't, etc. And I'm reminded, I grew up in New York City, and when it came to botany, as a New Yorker, and certainly did well enough in high school to go to Harvard, but I just knew there was grass, bushes, and trees.
That's all you need to know to survive.
In New York.
In New York.
Exactly, and not even that. But if I went with that knowledge to New Guinea, I'm sure I'd be,
out of luck,
as they say, dead meat.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Now, another controversial point related to psychometric, well, maybe not quite psychometric testing, is the whole ADD, attention deficit disorder, which also, obviously, child psychology, and there's some metrics around that. What are your perspectives on that?
I kind of went through the era of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and after with attention deficit disorder, that it was really I believe, and my personal editorial opinion, is that it was very underdiagnosed and misdiagnosed back in the 70s and 80s. Parents were condemned for being bad parents. That's why their children acted out and didn't pay attention in school. There was very little empathy for the kids from their teachers or toward the parents at all. Then I think more so with the advent of looking at stimulant medications like the application appropriate use of Ritalin, more appropriate kinds of diagnostic testing, people became a bit more aware of it, and it sort of went over to this tipping point. As people became more aware of it, there were more parent advocacy groups, one called CHAD, Children with Attention Deficit Disorder, and many others now, where people said, you know, this is a learning issue, this is a biological issue, it's not because of bad parenting, it's not because of, you know, red M&Ms or...
There was a time when they said schizophrenia was bad parenting.
Exactly, right, yeah, the schizophrenic mother, exactly. Yeah. So, so in behavioral health and mental health, there's oftentimes this kind of trend and pattern where you go through this schizophrenia or ADHD or what have you. Better science, better research studies, better psychometric testing protocols found that people did have attention deficit disorder. We later learned people thought you outgrew it, so by the time you graduated you were over it. We found that that wasn't the case, that people can continue on to have attention deficit disorder. We found that appropriate treatment can make people very adaptive and can be very successful in school, very successful in careers, very successful in college. The aspect of not condemning the parents, not blaming the victim or the child is very helpful. And then we got to this tipping point where then it became sort of this catch-all garbage can diagnosis, that as soon as someone didn't pay attention or fidgeted in their seat or seemed distracted, oh, you must have ADHD. Mm-hmm. You know, books came out driven to distraction, things like that. And then, you know, it lost its valence, it lost its potency because it was becoming overdiagnosed.
You think it's at that stage now?
I think it's starting to taper off. The populations I deal with more now are adult populations, less so children, but when I was still working with kids towards the tail end of the 90s, it seemed to be less in vogue and less popular. It might be an artifact in the Chicago area where there is, there are better facilities, better docs, I think. There may be a greater sophistication, but at least in the populations I was working with, people were becoming more sophisticated around understanding it, differentiating attentional problems between other kinds of diagnoses.
Right. Sort of a related point that we'll talk about after the break is autism. Obviously, autism has been known for a while, but increasing awareness. And so I want to talk a little bit about that after the break. You're watching Eye on Harvard with our guest, Dr. Chris Stout. I'm Ogan Gurel. Stay right there. Be right back.
We're moving faster than ever before. Even your ideal prospect will see your ad, click to your website, then decide to read on or read none in a mere 1 to 7 seconds. After that, you become invisible. So what's the answer? How do you capture and hold the attention of your target audience? In Time TV. The In Time TV network broadcasts industry-specific TV shows to the people who buy your products: surgeons, primary care physicians, dentists, podiatrists, chiropractors, hospital administrators can now watch live in-time programs on widescreen, on their PC or laptop while checking email. Shows can even be viewed on a cell phone during a train commute. In Time TV is peer-to-peer TV that covers the hot topics in industries that you sell to. In Time TV shows are broadcast worldwide via the internet, yet the cost of running a 60-second commercial is a fraction of what you'd pay for a display ad in a trade magazine. In Time TV is what your target audience is watching.
Keeping professionals engaged worldwide.
Mom?
Dad?
How long should I wait for you?
If I'm at soccer practice.
What if something happens? Will you come get me?
There's no reason not to have a plan in case of an emergency.
Should we go to the neighbor's house?
And some extremely good reasons why you should.
Can you tell me?
Talk to your family about what you would do in case of an emergency.
I'm Ogan Gurel. You're watching Eye on Harvard. Our guest, Dr. Chris Stout, the founding director of the Center for Global Initiatives, a world-renowned clinical psychologist, especially in the pediatric area. Wanted to round out with one topic is autism. Tell us a little bit about that, and in particular, we hear a lot about autism in children, but less so with adults.
Yeah, it's perhaps maybe is on my design of things getting popular and tipping and whatnot. I think statistically, I was just seeing somewhere recently in a journal about the prevalence rate seems to be picking up across child and adolescent.
I heard, yeah.
And it again, you know, chicken and the egg, are people becoming better diagnosticians, or is it just becoming more popular, and how accurate is the diagnosis, etc.? So, you know, those are always the controversial questions around that. What I'm starting to see is that there are more support programs for it. There are more accommodations available through schools. There are currently public federal laws. Public Law 101-472 helps people with any kind of learning disability, be it an attention deficit or a dyslexia or an autistic problem. And with that support, and with, I think, again, the better treatments that that are available to people today, these individuals are able to mature into adulthood. I think the interest, most of us have greater interest in childhood problems, and maybe even though the problems continue on to adulthood, the interest is lost for some reason. Perhaps our hearts go more out to children necessarily than adults.
Right.
But there are a variety of people that I know that are functioning quite well in jobs, living independently or living in group homes, living outside of their home, their parental home, and functioning quite well.
Well, that's, you know, a lot of, we thank you about ADD, autism, psychometric testing. I want to go into another controversial topic, and maybe not so controversial, but certainly very interesting. You wrote a very important book, or edited, I should say, a definitive book. It's a 4-volume set, of which this is the condensed edition, The Psychology of Terrorism. And I think a lot of people have talked about this, and political people have talked about using the psychology of terrorism. But obviously terrorism at its root is, to some extent, not about bombs, not even about ideology. It's about psychology.
Absolutely right.
And
bombs are tools.
The bombs are just tools. I mean, the end is to really impact psychology. So this is a really important topic at the forefront of, you know, a lot that's going on in the world. Benazir Bhutto wrote about democracy as being the inoculator against terrorism. And then Norman Mailer talked about anxiety as being the prevailing sort of mood of the 20th century existence. First of all, tell us a little bit about this book, what it's about, and what has come out of this book, Psychology of Terrorism.
Sure. The quick little bit about the background of it. With having worked with children, one of the populations that I found myself working a great deal with were children that had been sort of victimized, that they had issues of trauma, post-traumatic stress, etc. I was doing lecturing on children that were formerly child soldiers and the trauma of that and how that came around.
That in West Africa, or not just West Africa.
Yeah, but throughout Africa, but in particular the things I had focused on were in Western Africa. And that kind of got me into this world of, you know, the international aspects and recruiting people and, you know, suicide bombers, that whole, that's sort of how I made my transition from working with children to this kind of area. And in talking with a number of people and learning about this, it really, the aspect of looking at what terrorism does, it does it through psychology. The aspect of fear, that if my behavior is inhibited because I'm afraid of whatever it is I might be afraid of, some kind of negative impact on myself or my family or my livelihood, then I'm going to alter my behavior, which is, you know, the root of what psychology is. So think back, 2000, with 9/11, what happened after that impact here in the United States, really the first time on our soil that there was such a obvious, you know, dramatic impact. People didn't go out and go shopping. People didn't go out and invest in the stock market. In fact, the stock market dropped. People didn't say, "Hey, I think I'm going to buy a plane ticket and fly somewhere." You know, the airlines had a very difficult time of it, because when these kinds of things impact upon us, we hunker down. We get in the psychological bunker, if you will. We get fearful, and we don't do things that we might in any way think is risk-taking behavior. And risk might be investing in a stock because the stock market drops by hundreds of points. It might be flying an airplane because we don't know what's going to happen. Is the plane going to land safely or not?
So, to some extent, do you think that I don't want to impute over sophistication to, you know, this vague designation of terrorists. But, for example, whoever planned, or Osama bin Laden planned 9/11, do you think their goal was the psychological hunkering down?
I think so. I think so. The symbolic hitting of the World Trade Center was to strike at commerce. And the impact was the stock market, you know, went down the drain for, you know, immediately after that. And took a while for it to come back. I think the key things to fight back, to deal with the anxieties or the fears that go along with feeling intimidated or fearful, is to, if you will, take those risks, to fly on an airplane. The first two places I flew after 9/11 were Washington, D.C. and New York City. And it was a very different experience, you know, going through security, etc. But I had, you know, I had to be honest, I had some anxieties about it, but I thought, well, you know, I believe in the infrastructure. I believe in what the government was doing at the time to be supportive of things, to get people back out, and then I felt it was important to make those purchases, to keep my stock investments, to fly and to travel, to be wise and not be foolish about anything that I was doing, but to feel that I was prepared to be able to go out and do different kinds of things, and to not be intimidated into, you know, back in the psychological bunker.
Well, I won't be as controversial as Norman Mailer, but let me say one thing, and I don't want to politicize the discussion, certainly, but I think President Bush was much derided after 9/11. Maybe not at that time, but in retrospect, he was derided for literally a few days after 9/11 to tell people to go shopping. And he may very well have been advised. To some extent, you're saying that was an appropriate thing to say.
Right, to try and get things back to normal. When someone has gone through a traumatic experience, be it by proxy of watching the towers go down on television, or in reality of, you know, if you've had a trauma yourself, if you've lost a loved one, if you've had experienced a criminal act upon yourself or your property, or if you have had a flood or a fire, the things in psychology to help rehabilitate people is to try and get back into a normal sequence, not to alter your behavior. And it's not to say to be in denial or to act like everything's okay and everything's rosy, but to try and get back into the healthy aspects, the routine aspects that can bring comfort and solace in your life. And for some people, you know, shopping's a natural thing. You go to the grocery, you purchase clothes, you do whatever. He wasn't necessarily saying, you know, let's go out and be good, strong capitalists, but the economic aspect of getting the United States sort of back on its economic feet was important, that people would go back out and try and bring back the normal aspects of their life.
Right. So that's interesting, because I think, again, not to be overly political, I wish I was Norman Mailer, I'd say whatever I think, right? But it seems like at the same rate, the administration is maybe not moderating that fear. And we'll talk about that when we get back. This is Eye on Harvard. I'm Ogan Gurel. Our guest, Chris Stout. The topic of this segment is the psychology of terrorism. Stay right there.
Little girl till heaven home.
It's easy to tell if you've had way too many. But what if you've had just one too many? Buzz driving is drunk driving.
Hey guys, thanks for coming.
Are we in trouble?
No, you're not in trouble. I just want to set some ground rules.
Like what?
Well, remember last week when you hit Vinny in the head with the shovel?
I do not recall that.
Of course not. Well, it was pretty graphic. Too graphic for the kids. So I'm going to have to block you.
You know, I got to make this up to you. This is Vinny's watch, and I want you to have it. You deserve it.
No, thank you. That's really not necessary.
No, come here.
Welcome back. This is Eye on Harvard. I'm Ogan Gurel. Our guest, Chris Stout. We're talking about psychology of terrorism, which is actually coming out of his 4-volume series. And on the screen you can see the condensed edition. Picture that, Psychology of Terrorism, edited by Chris Stout. And we were talking earlier about the response to 9/11 and the traumas in general, whether by proxy or directly, to, without being Pollyannish, to just pursue normal everyday life. And President Bush's exhortation after that to go shopping, however derided, may have had some strong psychological basis.
True.
But on the other hand, the administration, we could say this, President Bush is a fellow Harvard grad of sorts, so it's fair game, right? Although some would say Dick Cheney's behind it. He's not a Harvard grad. But that the administration, instead of just moderating this fear, which is, as you say, the appropriate psychological response, in some ways has been criticizing for basically stoking the fears for whatever purposes.
Yeah.
What is?
It's, you know, it's a beautiful question, and Mailer would be proud.
Thank you.
The aspect, I think, that my critique, my editorial opinion around things is that, again, from a perspective of psychology, is that, you know, we have this rainbow of different alarms. And, you know, I'm involved in these kinds of books. I go to these workshops, etc., and I can't keep straight in my head, you know, red,
Orange,
yellow,
red,
or,
yeah,
you know, I don't know where we're at. I don't know what difference, you know, the shades are, whatever. And
I feel like we're on Jay Leno now, making jokes about that.
Yeah, well, and it's, you know, why is that? It's because it doesn't, for me at least, and maybe for others, it doesn't resonate. It doesn't click. And the aspect of my critique around, you know, general media things is that someone told me once at a conference, they said, no one ever buys a paper to learn that a plane landed safely. You know, there's a certain aspect that you want to, you know, you hear about a problem or whatever.
Right,
that's what's newsworthy, so to speak. And the aspect of talking about color coding or whatever, I think is fine, but I think what would be even more helpful and maybe help stick with people is, okay, it's whatever color. Now, what do I do? Do I fly or don't I fly? Do I, you know, stock up the basement and get ready for something to happen, or don't I? What do I need to do? And I think if, you know, whatever media, if it's print or internet or video, that when these kinds of things happen, and it's actually one of the things that I talked about in the book as an appendix, is what do I do if I have worries about this? And for what we've done in our own family is things that we don't have to have a terrorist attack, but if I have a flat tire and one of my children needs to be picked up at school, we've got a redundant backup system to be able to manage that. If something horrendous happened, we've got that same redundant backup system of phone calls and people, you know, neighbors, and a whole, you know, it's not a sophisticated system, it's simple and straightforward, but it makes me feel less anxious. It gets back to the anxiety aspect. If you can have planning things thoughtful when you're not in the midst of a crisis, and you can be thoughtful, you can work them out, you negotiate them with your neighbors, your spouse, your loved ones, whoever, then you feel more confident. And that, again, is a countering psychology to anxiety. When you feel empowered and you know what to do in a crisis, if that crisis ever comes, you can handle it. If the crisis doesn't come, you still got confidence that you can handle it if it does come your way.
So I think, psychologically speaking, it's the sense of control.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so I guess the two takeaways would be normalcy, as appropriate, and to proactively control what you can.
Absolutely, and I think that goes back to your earlier point vis-a-vis democracy. In a political structure, you know, there's really the support of the individual with the backup of the system. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. The support of people as individuals making wise choices, not acting like they're helpless and waiting for someone to come in and intervene for them, but doing what they can do. And after they've done what they can do, then being able to rely on infrastructure and backup systems to be able to support those choices.
So terrorism is ultimately aimed at individual psychology in a way.
Sure, sure.
And to the extent that democracy strengthens the individual, it is counter-terrorist. Is that? Do you think that's what?
I think that's what
Benazir Bhutto
was exactly. That's how I interpreted her comment, because that's exactly how I see it.
Let me just repeat for our viewers, if you've just come back, in the weekly Harvard Roundup, we had talked about Norman Mailer, who just passed away this morning, and Benazir Bhutto, also prominent in the news. And Benazir Bhutto, the former Pakistani Prime Minister and also Harvard graduate, wrote, "Democracy is necessary to peace and to undermining the forces of terrorism." And not that we're here for literary critiques of political statements, but I guess our interpretation of that would be that democracy empowers the individual.
Bingo. Yep.
And in a sense, Osama bin Laden and the terrorists at large, if you will, were not really attacking society through the psychology, but really individuals.
Exactly, and I think the caution for us, again, to speak editorial, as I think we have been, is that there isn't so much. I think that the criticisms is that oftentimes you can go too far and that there can be a backlash, and that the aspect, again, of having a moderate, reasonable response to things in terms of preparedness and feeling confident about things is one of the most healthy kinds of approaches.
What about this? You had written, this is a fascinating book, and there's several chapters here. The first one, written by yourself, Using Psychology to Counter Terrorism at the Personal and Community Level. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's some of the things we've talked about. Being able to have your own system for whatever your lifestyle is like, to be able to have backups with whatever kind of crisis might come your way. It doesn't have to be terroristic to have that system, because it could be just, again, something as simple as the flat tire and someone's late or missing or what have you. But then also, one of the things we talked about was what kinds of things are really reasonable threats and reasonable, fears to have. Is it going to be nuclear? Is it going to be biological? Is it going to be any of the other kinds of risks? And some of the research that I did found that the statistical likelihood of certain kinds of risks are very, very minimal. So if you have a high bad outcome kind of risk, but a low likelihood of that risk occurring, the fact that you know that and can communicate that to others takes some of the power out of it, the valence out of it. So I know that it would really be horrible if a nuclear bomb was dropped anywhere. Well, the likelihood of that is very, very low. That's why I think have the concerns about Iran, exactly, and North Korea. So in those kinds of aspects, that's why that makes the papers, because that brings that fear back up.
And to some extent, we had talked about how the administration may be doing a very appropriate, or has done an appropriate psychological moderation, get back to normalcy, but it's saying that it may be overstating certain facts or probabilities.
Correct.
This is Eye on Harvard, fascinating program. We still have a lot to go with Dr. Chris Stout. I'm Ogan Gurel. Look forward to seeing you shortly.
Any questions?
No.
You know.
We're not magicians, we can't read your mind.
We answer questions, each and every kind.
What are the side effects, doctor, doctor?
How many times have you done this before?
Questions are the answer.
Will this react with my other medicine?
What are all these tests even for?
You have the power to say what's on your mind.
We read your questions, each and every kind. Questions are the answer. Questions are the
Welcome, I'm Ogan Gurel. We're here with Dr. Chris Stout. We're talking during the break about this whole concept of using psychology to counter terrorism. And there are two levels to this. One is countering the impact on terrorism on yourself, your family, your community. And as you mentioned, the concept of normalcy and appropriately assessing the risks. Nuclear holocaust is terrible, but the probability is very low.
Correct.
The other part of this is using psychology on a national level, from a policy perspective or grassroots, however it may be, to in effect counter terrorism in terms of the aims of, quote, the other side. Osama bin Laden, etc.
Right.
And I think that's what I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt, another Harvard graduate, was trying to achieve when he said we have nothing to fear but fear itself on the brink of World War II, and etc. So if you were President Bush or or advising him, what sort of psychology for this time would be analogous that the American people should have to counter terrorism?
I think FDR's comment was really one to make people feel secure and strong. I think that's a similar kind of message today. I think, again, being more political psychology than clinical psychology
Yes.
in this statement, is that there's almost a paradox that can exist that I think if you take a look maybe from an ideological perspective, people that are against the kinds of cultural norms and mores that we have and that perhaps Europeans have, etc., is the fact of democracy and how democracy and perhaps capitalism can oftentimes go hand in hand. And I think the aspect of some of the freedoms that we take, maybe pre-9/11 even took more for granted, perhaps sometimes can be a little bit more restricted. And I think there's concerns today that perhaps we have less of a free society, that maybe there's more profiling or maybe there's more kinds of restrictions because there's an attempt from a crime prevention, if you will. A terrorist act is a criminal act.
Yes.
It's not only a political act, it's a criminal act. So in the context of trying to have better enforcement and to have terrorist prevention kinds of things occur, it's a very delicate balance that we don't then trample any kind of civil rights or rights of the individual, which would be this ironic paradox around the individual in a democracy.
And that would be, in effect, as often many have said, handing over a victory to the terrorists.
Exactly. If we diminish, my opinion, if we diminish our civil liberties to a point in which we're no longer as democratic as had been intended by our forefathers, then we've got a bigger problem on our hands.
Right. As Benjamin Franklin once said, a nation or a country which sacrifices liberty for safety deserves neither.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Perfect.
he had a lot of good quotes. Let's talk about your Center for Global Initiatives, and you can see that on your screen, www.global initiatives, Center for Global Initiatives.org. It's right up on your screen. Tell us a little bit about that. We talked at the outset, interdisciplinary organization around healthcare, and I think it's actually related to what we talked about also. It's not a West-centric our healthcare system is best, and we're going to go out and export it to developing countries. Tell us about your center.
Sure, that's a wonderful place to start with it. We are very much not. We fight against the West knows best kind of hubris.
Yeah.
Every project that we're involved with that is a service project has been born by being invited by whoever it is in whatever country we're working in, which is, I think, perhaps a unique kind of an approach.
As opposed to parachuting in.
Exactly, like the commandos, we're going to fix everything and parachute right back out.
Right.
And
that would be interesting.
Yeah, yeah. The aspect that we have is, again, cross and multidisciplinary. We have professionals as well as students. We have undergraduates as well as graduate students. We have medical students, public health students, you name it. And we work in a variety of different kinds of cultures and areas with very much as I mentioned early on with looking at children, a very strict cultural sensitivity to whatever kind of work it is that we're doing. That even right now we have a project that we're starting in Cambodia. We're just at the very basic putting the team together. We've got physicians, nurses, public health people, graduate students that are all coming together to put together a project for providing to do training to indigenous women in rural Cambodia as a proof of concept project. And one of the key things we're looking at to provide emergency medical services, public health system kinds of work, and primary care services in emergency situations. So if someone has a stroke, has a heart attack, broken leg, any kind of trauma, that they could at least be stabilized until they're medically stable enough to be able to be transported.
So in a way, democratizing healthcare for Cambodia.
Very much the strength of the individual to help the other. In that context, we've got one group of people that are looking from an epidemiological perspective of what are the problems that we need to focus on. So when we put together trainings, those trainings are relevant to what the needs are. We have another group of people that are looking at the aspect of how can we come in and provide these trainings in an area where we already have the invitation, but where we are culturally sensitive to issues of gender, issues of race, issues of language, issues of age, so that when we come in, again, it's not a bull in a china shop of we will know the medical aspects, but we need to couch that in a culturally sensitive aspect to be able to maximize the training. Perhaps a quick example of that. There's a book that we're going to be using as a training manual to train us, not to train them once we're over there, but to train us prior to going over, which talks about, for example, training someone about malaria. So there is a wonderful illustration of this of someone with a large poster, and they're pointing to a vector of malaria, a mosquito.
Yes.
And the mosquito's about this big, show that this is what conveys malaria, and it shows two people in the back saying, "My gosh, that monster is huge. Thank goodness we don't have any of those around here." So something, again, as simple as, from our perspective, we understand that this is a blow-up or whatever, but that doesn't translate well. Even if you're saying it in their native tongue, that those kinds of aspects. So there's a lot, again, of humility, I think, that we need to learn and that we need to bring with us in any kind of project that we have a great deal to learn from them as well. And when we go over to have a specific kinds of project to do something specific medically, that we need to do it in a way that makes sense and isn't us knowing it all.
Well, sounds great. That's the Center for Global Initiatives. It's on your screen, the Center for Global Initiatives.org. Dr. Chris Stout, our guest, is the founding director. Some fascinating programs. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a great program. Thank you. See you next week. I'm Ogan Gurel, Eye on Harvard.